Hey, welcome to MindMajix. In this video tutorial, I'm going to talk about important interview questions on Spring Boot. Friends, everyone knows Spring Boot is one of the leading IT technology in current IT market. Most of the companies are using Spring Boot for their application development. So here we categorized Spring Boot interview questions in three parts. One is a beginner level, one more is intermediate level, one more is advanced level. When it comes to beginner level, the first question is, what is Spring Boot and what is the need of that? Spring Boot is basically a Spring module. The main aim of this Spring Boot is to simplify the application development, whatever we are implementing with the help of Spring framework. So nowadays, most of the companies are preferred to implement their applications. Instead of Spring, they are working with Spring Boot. So basically, the Spring Boot is used to create a standalone Spring-based application that you just need to run. It basically removes a lot of configuration and dependencies, aiming at rapid application development. And Spring Boot comes with the auto dependency injection, embedded HTTP servers, auto configurations, etc. So why most of the companies are using Spring Boot? Because the reason is actually, the first one is there we no need to bother about lot of configurations and dependencies, and it simplifies the application development. We called it as rapid application development. Spring Boot comes with the auto dependency injection. Spring Boot comes with embedded HTTP servers, auto configurations, many features are there. The second question is, what is the difference between Spring and Spring Boot? Everyone knows the importance of Spring. Basically, Spring is an open source, lightweight framework widely used to develop enterprise applications. As part of Spring, we are going to work with different modules like Spring Core, Spring Web, Spring JDBC, Spring ORM, Spring Web module, Spring Web MVC module, Spring JEE module. But the main agenda of the Spring is it is used to implement enterprise applications. Am I right or not? But when it comes to Spring Boot is built on top of the conventional Spring framework. I mean to say, Spring Boot is built on top of the Spring. So Spring Boot is nothing but we are just going to simplify the application development of Spring's framework. So the main agenda of Spring Boot, it's mainly used to develop RESTful APIs. And the second difference is Spring is the most important feature. The Spring most important feature is dependency injection. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, the most important feature of the Spring Boot is auto configuration. When it comes to dependency injection point of view in Spring, we are going to write a lot of code in XML files, right? But when it comes to Spring Boot, we no need to bother about XML configuration because Spring Boot supports auto configuration. It simplifies your application development. And the third difference is it helps to create a loosely coupled application. Spring main aim is to create an application which is loosely coupled application. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, it helps to create standalone applications. Just like a standalone application, you just need to run the application. If you are implementing any Spring application, to run the Spring application, we need to set the server explicitly, right? For example, we need to set either Tomcat Server, either JBoss server, WebLogic server, whatever it may be. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, Spring Boot provides embedded servers such as Tomcat, Jetty, etc. And the one more difference is to create a Spring application, to run a Spring application, we need one deployment descriptor actually. Like there we need to specify the dispatcher servlet information. There we need to specify the controller information. All this information is required, right? Either in web.xml file or in Spring servlet.xml, dispatcher servlet.xml file, any XML file, or Spring configuration.xml file. Okay. In any XML file, we need to provide the entire information related to deployment descriptor. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, there is no requirement for a deployment descriptor. You don't need to specify anywhere. You don't need to bother about the controllers. You don't need to bother about the view resolvers. It will be recognized automatically. Okay. And one more difference is to create a Spring application, the developers write lots of code, lots of boilerplate code we need to write in Spring application development. But when it comes to Spring Boot, it reduces the lines of code. When it comes to annotations point of view, also basically when in Spring we need to write a lot of annotations, but in Spring Boot we no need to bother about the lot of annotations also. Even for example, when it comes to Spring point of view, if you are working with 3 annotations, but when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, we are just going to represent it with only 1 annotation. And one more difference is Spring does not provide support for the in-memory database. But the beauty of Spring Boot is it provides support for the in-memory database such as H2. Okay. And one more simple question is, what are the features of Spring Boot? To be frank, there are many features are there in Spring Boot, but here I'm just trying to categorize all these Spring features into 4 sections. One is Spring Initializer, and other one is Spring CLI, and one more is Auto Configuration, and the 4th one is Externalized Configuration. What does mean by Spring Initializer? Spring Initializer is basically one simple tool that bootstraps your Spring Boot project. This Spring Boot feature powers project creation through URL. I mean to say, if you want to create or if you want to generate one simple Spring Boot project, you just need to open start.spring.io website. So that is the Spring Initializer URL. There you can able to create your Spring Boot project by just specifying the required information, required plugins, required Java version, required project name, required dependencies, all these things. And the second feature is Spring CLI. One more feature is Spring Boot CLI. CLI, the full form is command line tool. So by default, Spring Boot contains one command line tool. The Spring Boot CLI is a command line tool that can be used to develop a Spring application quickly. By using the Spring CLI, you can execute Groovy scripts also. And at the same time, so you can code by using your knowledge of Java also actually. I would say Spring CLI also use it to create Spring Boot project, and at the same time it is used to test your Spring Boot project. There you can able to write either Groovy scripts or either Java. And the third feature is auto configuration. As we already told you, when it comes to dependency injection point of view, we need to focus on XML files for loosely coupling point of view. But when it comes to Spring Boot, we no need to bother about any, it supports auto configuration. You no need to write any configuration related information using XML. So here we can reduce the XML files creation. While generally, while creating a new project, our Spring Boot allows you to choose dependencies for your project. If these dependencies based on which the auto configuration features load specific default configuration. I mean to say, for example, if you are working with database, or if you want to communicate with any MySQL database. For that, you are going to use JPA dependency. At that moment, what happened when you are working with JPA, the related dependencies which are hibernate related dependencies will come automatically. I mean to say we just need to focus on only one dependency, so that will, along with that dependency, the remaining supported dependencies will come automatically. That is the meaning of that. And one more feature is externalized configuration. Even though if you want to provide some information related to configuration, like for example, if you are working on any Spring Boot MVC application, there you created some view pages with the help of JSP. If you want to represent those JSP pages, then you need to specify what is the prefix, what is the suffix, right? Generally, we are going to represent those prefix and suffix information in Spring configuration file and the view resolver configurations, right? But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, all configuration parameters are read from either application.properties or application.yaml. These are the two files actually. Application.properties will come by default along with the project creation, or if you want to pass the information either application.yaml, you need to create it actually. From these two resources, you can able to send some extra required information for your Spring Boot project actually. If you want to pass any configuration related information, you can able to use these two resources. However, there may be cases when you want to move your configuration from one environment to another environment also. Okay. And one more question is, what are the advantages of Spring Boot? There are many advantages. Generally, as I already told you, Spring Boot is basically used to create stand-alone Spring application. There you just need to click on run button actually. That can be started using Java jar. And second advantage is it tests web application easily with the help of different embedded HTTP servers such as Tomcat, Jetty, etc. You no need to bother about any explicit HTTP servers. You no need to install it. You no need to add it. So Spring Boot application by default comes with some embedded HTTP servers such as Tomcat, HTTP, etc. And one more advantage is it provides opinionated starter form to simplify our Maven configuration. I mean to say, as I already told you, when you are working with like Spring with JPA communication, at that moment, there you just need to worry about the Spring JPA related dependency. So you just need to take the starter dependency related to JPA. So then it comes with the remaining dependencies automatically. The supported dependencies will come automatically. A starter dependencies will help you to add into the POM file of Maven. A POM is nothing but project object model. So there we are going to add only the starter dependencies. The supported dependencies will come automatically. For example, if you are working with web application, then you just need to take the support of only starter web. The remaining supported dependencies will come automatically. And one more advantage is there is no requirement for XML configuration. As I already told you, we no need to write any XML files. Even though if you want to specify any configuration related information, then you can able to specify all those information either in application.properties file or application.yaml file. And one more feature is it offers a CLI tool for developing and testing the Spring Boot application. A CLI is basically command line tool, command line interface of Spring Boot tool. So this tool will help you to create your Spring Boot application as well as test your Spring Boot application. And Spring Boot offers n number of plugins. I mean to say you can able to create your project either by using a Maven plugin or Gradle plugin, whatever it may be. It depends on your requirement. And one more advantage is it increases productivity and reduces development time. Because we no need to bother about any configuration. We no need to bother about any dependencies. We just need to add only starter dependencies, and application development also very easy. We no need to add any servers actually. You just need to click on run button, just like what we are doing in the standalone application. So then what happened? Obviously, when it comes to Spring Boot takes very less time to implement the application, and it increases the productivity also. And one more question is, how many ways are there to create Spring Boot application? So there are 4 ways are there. Here we just categorized into 4 sections. The first one is, if you want to create Spring Boot project, then just create one simple Maven project, and there you just need to add all the starter dependencies. Okay. Or the second procedure is, you can able to use Spring Initializer. As I already told you, Spring Initializer is basically a simple URL. So like start.spring.io, there you can able to create Spring Boot project by just passing the required information related to plugins, related to Java version, related to dependencies, all this information. And third procedure is, you can able to create Spring Boot project in STS IDE also. The full form of STS is Spring Tool Suite. Here you just need to create one simple Spring Starter project. There you just need to add all the required dependencies, and the Spring Boot project will be created automatically. And one more procedure is, you can able to create Spring Boot project by using CLI2, command line interface 2. And one more question is, what are the Spring Boot starters? As I already told you, when it comes to Spring Boot project development, we are going to use a lot of starter dependencies. The main agenda of starter dependencies, when we are working with only one starter dependency, then the remaining supported dependencies will come automatically. Spring Boot provides a number of starters that allows us to add jars in the class path. Spring Boot built-in starters make development easier and happy. As I already told you, if you are implementing any Spring Boot web application, there you just need to add only Spring Boot starter web dependency. The supported dependencies will come automatically. Spring Boot starters are the dependency descriptors. In the Spring Boot framework, all the starters follow a naming pattern, similar naming pattern, that is spring-boot-starter-. There we need to write the related dependency name. For example, if you are working with JPA, there we need to write spring-boot-starter-JPA. Or if you are working with web, then you need to write spring-boot-starter-web. Here star denotes a particular type of application. For example, if you want to use Spring and JPA for database access, we just need to include spring-boot-starter-data JPA dependency in our form.xml file of the project. And one more question is, what happens in the background when a Spring Boot application is run as a Java application? As I already told you, Spring Boot application is just like a standalone application. We just need to click on run button. When we are trying to run as a Java application, generally we are just trying to run it as a standalone application, even though it is a web application. Then what happens internally? Generally, if it is web application, then it is going to execute with the support of server, right? But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, we are not going to add any embedded, any servers explicitly, but as I already told you, Spring Boot by default comes with embedded servers such as Tomcat, Jetty, etc. Right? So when a Spring Boot application is executed as run as Java application, then automatically launches the Tomcat server. So if you have any doubt, you can just check the dependencies section. There definitely some dependencies for related to Tomcat also added in your application. Okay. And one more question is, what is Spring Actuator and its advantage? Basically, an actuator is one of the best parts of Spring Boot, which consists of production-ready features to help you monitor and manage your application. I mean to say, if you want to manage and monitor your application in all the corners, at that time, Spring Actuator will help you. With the help of Actuator, you can monitor what is happening inside the running application. Actuator dependency figures out the metrics and makes them available as a new endpoint in your application and retrieves all required information from the web. You can identify beans, the health status of your application, CPU usage of your application, and many more features with the help of Actuator. So to enable Actuator, you just need to add the related dependency. And one more question is, can we change the port of the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? The answer is yes, we can change the port number of embedded Tomcat server. By default, what happened? Tomcat server default port number is 8080, right? If you want to change the port number of Tomcat in Spring Boot application, so there you just need to send some configuration related information. As I already told you, there are different ways to pass externalized configuration information, either by using application.properties file or application.yaml file. Here I'm trying to pass the information with the help of application.properties file. Then in application.properties file, you just need to write server.port is equal to like 8084 or 9000 or 2022, whatever it may be, your wish. And one more question, the last question at the beginner level, what are the possible sources of external configuration? We already discussed about external configuration, right? If you want to send some external configuration information, there are different ways to pass the information, either by using application.properties or application.yaml, right? So if we want to pass external configuration, there are different possible sources are there. Spring Boot allows the developers to run the same application in different environments. Well, this is done with the support it provides for external configuration. Either it uses environment variables, properties files, command line arguments, YAML files, and system properties to mention the required configuration properties. Okay, so here the point is, Spring Boot basically allows the developers to run the same application in different environments. Okay, like for example, you can able to pass the external configuration related information, either it uses environment variables or properties files or command line arguments or YAML files. Okay, all these are the possible sources. Now I'm going to move to middle level Spring Boot interview questions. When it comes to middle level, most of the interviewer are going to ask the question related to thyme leaf. What is thyme leaf and how to use thyme leaf? Basically, thyme leaf is a server-side Java template engine which helps processing and creating HTML, XML, JavaScript, CSS, and text. I mean, any front end if you want to use in Spring Boot application development. At that moment, most of the Spring Boot developers are preferred to work with Thyme Leaf. The main agenda of Thyme Leaf is it basically one simple server-side Java template engine. So this template engine, which helps you to process the information which is created at HTML or XML or JavaScript information or CSS or text information, whatever it may be. If you want to process that information at your server-side pages, at that moment, this Thyme Leaf template engine will help you. And one more question is, what is the use of Spring Boot Dev tools? Basically, the Spring Boot Dev tools are very important when you are implementing Spring Boot project or Spring Boot application. Because without Spring Boot Dev tools, even you are trying to modify any resource of the Spring Boot application or any changes in your Spring Boot application, then you need to rerun your application, right? But by using the Spring Boot development tool, to be frank, this is one of the amazing features provided by Spring Boot, where it restarts the Spring Boot application whenever any changes are being made in the code. I mean to say, if any changes are made in the code, you don't need to bother about running your Spring Boot application. So that will be run automatically with the help of Spring Boot Dev tools. Here, you no need to right click on the project and you no need to run your application again and again. Spring Boot Dev tools will help you to do this work actually for every code change. Okay. And one more simple question is, what is the default database configured in Spring Boot? As I already told you, Spring Boot by default comes with one in-memory database, that is H2. Okay. So when you are working with any database, first you need to create some database, right? For example, if you are working with MySQL database, then you need to create some database name, okay, like create database related to your project requirement, right? When it comes to H2 point of view also, H2 database is an in-memory database configured in Spring Boot. The default name of the H2 database that is configured by Spring Boot is testdb. Here the default database is configured in Spring Boot application. The name is testdb. Okay. And one more simple question is how to execute Spring Boot project using boot CLI. As I already told you, to execute Spring Boot application, to create and test your Spring Boot application, there are different tools are there. In that, Spring Boot CLI tool is one tool. Spring Boot CLI, command line interface tool, is nothing but a command line tool which is provided by Spring so that you can develop your application quicker and faster. So to execute your application by using Spring Boot project using CLI, you just need to download the CLI from Spring official website and extract those files. So there you can able to see a bin folder present in the Spring setup, which is used to create your Spring Boot application. Okay. This command line contains one folder, that is bin folder. There you can able to see the project set, I mean Spring setup, okay, which is used to create Spring Boot application. One more question is, what is auto configuration in Spring Boot? Auto configuration is basically a process by which Spring Boot automatically configures all the infrastructural beans. For example, if we are trying to work with Spring with JDBC, then the Spring Boot auto configuration feature automatically registers the data source and JDBC template bean. The entire process of automatically declaring the framework specific bean without the need of writing the XML code or Java config code explicitly is called auto configuration, which is done by Spring Boot with the help of one simple annotation, that is either @enabled auto configuration, or alternatively by default it comes with @Spring Boot application. I mean to say, if you want to work with Spring with JDBC, basically what happened, you need to write one XML file. There you just need to specify all the information related to beans, like what is the driver, what is the database you are using. There you need to specify all the information related to your driver class, URL, username, password, hibernate properties, and JDBC template bean and your user bean. All this information you need to specify in the configuration file using XML file. But when it comes to Spring Boot point of view, you don't need to bother about any XML configuration. You just need to specify whatever the JDBC information is required. I mean, whatever the database you are working with, you just need to specify all the information in the application.properties. You don't need to bother about any XML configuration. Okay. And one more simple question is, what is YAML? YAML is basically a human readable data serialization language. It is commonly used for configuration files. Compared to properties file, YAML file is much more structured and less less confusing in case we want to add complex properties in the configuration file. As can be seen in YAML, just like a hierarchical configuration data. Okay, I mean to say, for example, if you want to specify the information related to data source, like for example, if you are trying to write like app dot data or something, app dot program dot username, app dot program dot password, something. So the app dot program is repeated, then you are going to write that information in just like a hierarchical format, like app, after that program, or app dot app colon data, and after that you are just going to represent username, you are going to represent password, you are going to represent URL, whatever it may. You're just going to write it in the form of hierarchical configuration data. So that is the main benefit of YAML. When you are writing, okay, any configuration related information, what the suggestion is, instead of application.properties, you can able to pass the information by using YAML support also, actually. YAML support. But in the YAML, we just need to follow some hierarchical pattern. Okay, whatever the repeated terms are there, basically we are just going to keep it in the form of hierarchical, one after another, and the common thing. And after that, we need to specify the specific information one after another. And next question is how to implement exception handling in Spring Boot. Spring provides a very useful way to handle exceptions using controller advice annotation. We'll be implementing a controller advice class which will handle all the exceptions that is thrown by the controller class. Okay, so if you want to handle the exception properly in Spring Boot application, so there you just need to work with a very useful way to handle exceptions using controller advice. Okay, we need to implement this controller advice class which will handle all the exception that is thrown by the controller class. And one more question is how to configure Hibernate in Spring Boot. How to configure Hibernate in Spring Boot. To be frank, if you want to configure Hibernate in Spring Boot, you no need to bother about all the Hibernate dependencies. You just need to work with one simple starter dependency that is Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. And if you are working with H2 database, H2 configuration or MySQL configuration. Instead of H2, you can able to work with any other databases also. So now you need to provide all the database connection properties in application.properties file of your application in order to connect to your JPA code with the database actually. Okay. Hibernate is nothing but you are not going to add all the dependencies which are related to Hibernate. You just need to work with only one starter dependency, especially that is JPA dependency. The remaining supported Hibernate dependencies will come automatically. Okay. And one more simple question is how to enable Actuator in Spring Boot application. As I already told you, there are many benefits Actuator. Actuator will help us to monitor our application in all aspects. I mean to say in all corner. For enable this Spring Boot Actuator endpoints to your Spring Boot application, we have to add the Spring Boot Starter Actuator dependency in our application configuration file. Actually. Okay. Next, one more question. This is the last question at middle level, I mean intermediate level. The question is how to create a simple custom endpoint in Spring Boot Actuator. A very simple. If you want to create one simple custom endpoint in Spring Boot application, you need to use one simple annotation. The annotation name is @ endpoint annotation. Okay, @ endpoint annotation. And here I'm just moving into advanced level. Okay, these are the questions which are related to logging or security or authentication or any integrations. Okay, on these topics, question number 21 is how to implement security for Spring Boot application. So to implement security for Spring Boot application, there we need to work with one starter dependency. The dependency name is Spring-boot-starter-security. That is the dependency name. We have to add the security config. It requires very little code, like config class we have, config class will have to extend with one more adapter class, that is web security configurer adapter. And there we need to override all the methods. It's the simple way to apply security on Spring Boot application. And one more simple question is how to use logger in Spring Boot. Basically, logging is very important in every application development. Generally, logging will help you to track all your application information. There you can able to get all the log information. So by using this log information, we can able to know whether the cursor is moving to from one resource to another resource. Or even though for error point of view, also we are going to get some kind of logs file. Based on the logs information only, we can able to know what is happening internally in the application, right? So to be frank, to apply this logging, there are different possibilities. There are many logging options are available in Spring Boot. Okay, either you can able to apply logging on Spring Boot applications using log4j2. Log4j2. Either you can able to work with using Lombok. Lombok also the same purpose. There you can able to get the log information actually. Okay, and one more simple question is why Spring Boot is used for microservices. It's very important actually. Nowadays, most of the people or most of the developers are using Spring Boot to implement REST API services or microservices, especially that is the main agenda of Spring Boot actually. Because there are many drawbacks when we are implementing REST API or microservices with the help of Spring. So that's the reason most of the developers are using the Spring Boot to implement RESTful services or microservices actually. REST APIs, RESTful services are different, microservices are something different. In microservices, what happens? You can write code for your single functionality. There you can use different technology stacks for different microservices as per the skill set. Okay, I mean to say you can develop this type of microservices with the help of Spring Boot very quickly, as Spring Boot gives priority to convention over configuration, which increases the productivity of your developers. I mean to say, most of the people are using Spring Boot to implement microservices, because by using Spring Boot, we can able to create microservices as early as possible. I mean, some quickly we can able to create it. And one more simple question is, what are the uses of @request mapping and @REST controller annotations in Spring Boot? Generally, these are the two annotations are very important at the time of Spring application development also. Basically, request mapping and REST controller both are help you to represent controller class and the endpoint actually. I mean to say the path information. Basically, we can able to represent @request mapping annotations at two levels. One is at class level and other one is method level in your controller class. For example, the global request path that needs to be mapped on a controller class, that can be done by using @request mapping at class level. I mean, if you want to write some global request path, okay, to the entire class actually. So there we are just going to write a class level request. There we are going to use a request mapping annotations at class level. Okay. If you need to map a particular request, if you want to specify it actually, for example, if you want to move to home page with one path, to move contact page, there is some other path is there. To move about a page, there is some separate path. At that moment, we are just going to use this @request mapping annotations at method level with different path. Or if you want to globalize it actually, at that moment, we are going to use it at class level. Okay. And the @REST controller annotation is used at the class level. Obviously, REST controller will help you to represent, the controller related class as a controller class. To represent that class as controller class, we're just going to use this @REST controller annotations at class level. What is the benefit of this annotation? You can use this @REST controller annotation when you need to use that class as a request handler class actually. So all the requests can be mapped and handled in that class. Okay. Next, one more question is, what are the build tools we are using to develop Spring Boot application? Build tools is nothing but, as I already told you, to implement Spring Boot application using either YAML as well as Gradle actually. Both the things are possible. So Gradle is nothing but, I hope if you have a basic idea about Android application development, okay, or Groovy. So there basically we are just going to work with the Gradles, okay. So if you want to work with, it's a different build tools actually, Spring Boot application. There may be, you can able to use YAML tool or Gradle tool actually. Okay. Next, One more simple question is how to handle 404 error in Spring Boot. So to answer this question, I'm just going to take one simple scenario. Assume that, for example, I'm just trying to capture some information of some stock related information, actually. Some stock details are in our database. I'm just trying to capture the stock related information. For example, there are no stock details in the database, and still whenever you hit the get method, then you will get one response status code that is 200 that represents okay, right? Even though the resource is not found, which is not expected. So instead of 200, what we need to do, we need to get 404 error. 404 is nothing but if the resource is not found there, we need to get this type of error. So to handle this, you need to create an exception in the above scenario, that is stock not found exception. Okay, I mean to say, if you're trying to capture any information related to stock, if the stock details are not there, if the resource is not there, then instead of getting 200 status code, we need to get 404 status code. For that, what you need to do, you need to create some separate exception in the for the above scenario, actually, that is like stock not found exception. Okay, and one more simple question is it possible to replace the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Here the question is, generally, as I already told you, when we are working with Spring Boot application, it by default comes with some embedded servers, right? Like HTTP server, Tomcat server, Jetty, all these things, right? If we consider the fact Spring Boot by default comes up with the embedded server, everyone knows this point, right? If you don't want to use the Tomcat, then Tomcat comes with three types of embedded servers. Either you can use Tomcat, either you can use Jetty, or you can use Undertow. If you don't want to work with Tomcat, you can able to work with either Jetty or Undertow. Okay. And one more simple question is how to implement pagination and sorting with Spring Boot. Pagination is nothing but instead of displaying all the information in one page, we are just going to, I mean to say, we are just going to give some limitations actually, or we are just trying to see the information one page after another page. Okay, there we are just going to keep a lot of pages. Okay, using Spring Boot, achieving pagination is very simple actually. Using the Spring Data JPA, this is achieved passing pageable like org.springframework.data.domain.pageable to the repository methods. Okay, if you want to work with either pageable or sorting information, you just need to work with this class. I mean org.springframework.data.domain.pageable to the repository methods. Okay. And one more simple question, that is how to implement profiles using Spring Boot. So very important question, because when it comes to application development, basically there may be different environments out there, like development environment, QA environment, pre-production environment, production environment, etc. etc. Those are called profiles basically. Spring profiles allows users to register beans depending on the profile. So that profile may be related to development, that profile may be related to testing, that profile may be related to production, etc. I mean, so when the application is running in development, only certain beans can be loaded. If the application is running in production environment, then certain beans should be loaded. Suppose our requirement is that the Swagger documentation by enabled only for the QA environment, not for the production environment. Okay, then what happens? We just need to disable it other profiles. So this can be done by using profiles. Spring Boot makes using profiles Very, very easy. And one more simple question is how to implement, and this is the last question, okay, how to implement batches using Spring Boot. Batches or batch processing is nothing but we are just going to work with a lot of functions, actually many functions. Spring Boot batch provides reusable functions that are essential in processing large volumes of records, including logging, tracing, transaction management, okay, job processing statistics, job restart, skip, and resource management, whatever it may be. Okay. It also provides more advanced technical services and features that will be enable extremely high value and high performance batch jobs through optimization and partitioning techniques, either simple as well as complex. These high value batch jobs can leverage the framework in a highly scalable manner to process significant volumes of information. Okay, so this is one of the feature when it comes to Spring Boot point of view. There we can able to handle the batches, or we can able to implement the batches with reusable functions that are especially essential in the processing of any operations, like either you are trying to process large values of records, like for logging or tracing or transaction management, whatever it may be. Okay. So I hope these are the questions when it comes to Spring Boot point of view. We prepared. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you. We'll meet in the next video.